Now, while the heads-up display is great for doing a few basic adjustments to your text, where you really want to go to get into things is the inspector. So right here I have the inspector open. If you don't, if you're in the library or the file browser, you can just click on it up here, or you can go right to F4. F4 will open up actually the text tab, the fourth tab of the inspector. That's where we're interested in. I'll briefly mention the properties inspector, because you'll see here the same set of transforms or transform parameters that we used in the canvas. In the canvas we moved and rotated and scaled the text. You can do the same thing right here in the transform controls. The cool thing about using the inspector is you can type in exact values, but you can also reset with this hooked arrow. So if I click that hooked arrow, the text becomes exactly centered based on this anchor point. Now it's low because this anchor point is kind of high up in the whole thing, so I might drag in Y to move it directly straight up, but now I know it's centered horizontally. So pretty straightforward there. Most of these controls are available in the heads-up display. Let's go to the text inspector. This is really where all the good stuff is. So we've got 3 different tabs to the text inspector: format, style, and layout. And I'm not going to bore you to tears going through every single parameter in here, but I am going to pick out a few things that I think are worth mentioning. Specifically, check it out, collection. This is the same set of collections that we saw either Command-T right here in Show Fonts or in Font Book. So since we created a collection, we can select that collection right here. So I go to my Final Cut Pro 10 fonts, and then I have just those fonts available in this pop-up menu. So it's a much shorter menu. It's easier to navigate and choose a specific kind of font out of this menu. I'm going to undo that and go back to the font I had there before. And then I can go to some other collection, for instance, classic fonts or modern fonts. And I'll go to modern. I'll select this Helvetica Neue. This is a very, very common font. In fact, there's a great documentary about this font, Helvetica, if you're into fonts. And then you've got these same controls that we already saw in the heads-up display. So I'm not going to talk too much about these guys. But there's some advanced formatting options that we're going to come back to later quite a bit. I'll just mention a few here. In particular, rotation. Instead of rotating the entire block of text, if I drag in this little value field, we'll rotate the individual letters. Now, admittedly, I don't have much need to do this unless I'm doing some kind of, I don't know, Sesame Street video or something. But this can come in handy, so it's good to be familiar and know where it is. Also, the slant parameter allows you to do some interesting things in terms of slanting the text left to right. The thing to think about these is, in terms of animation, anything that you can change over here can be animated to change over time. And that's where it gets really interesting. Let's go down to this mono space, and that's usually not going to do anything very interesting. It creates a huge amount of spacing between the text. So you can choose mono space and then adjust the tracking. But with this particular text, it doesn't do anything useful. I'm going to undo that. And then all caps. This is very cool for certain uses. So if I click all caps, it forces every letter to be capitals, but what were lowercase letters are now not as big as the uppercase letters. And this is an effect that you can't create any other way unless you had separate text objects for the S and the F and the N and the Y. But this way, it's all one single text object and can be animated as a single text object. Now you may notice when I did that, there is a cap size, so I can adjust how big those little guys are. I'll make them smaller. But the spacing between the letters is terrible now, right? It looks terrible. So that gets into something called kerning. And kerning is something you'd want to do pretty much on any piece of text, but I'm going to use it here because it's very obvious. Kerning refers to the ability to change the spacing between individual letters, also called glyphs, between individual glyphs. And the way that you kern is, I'm going to double click to highlight the text. I'm going to click once more to click between 2 letters. And then to kern the letters, what you want to do is hold down both the Option and the Command keys, and then you're going to use the bracket keys. They're above and a little bit to the left of your return key. So if I hit the left bracket key, I can tighten up that distance between those letters. So I can go through here, and you can see I can change the spacing. It'll take a little bit of time. It moves quite slowly because usually kerning you're doing very minute adjustments, but you can really see the difference here. Okay? I'm actually going to undo those, and I'm going to turn off all caps. I just wanted you to see where it was very obvious. And let's just retype San Francisco. Okay? So even though this looks nicely spaced, frequently you're going to want to go in and make a few changes to the kerning. For instance, here with New York, I might hold down Option-Command and tuck the O in a little under the Y. And then I might go in and move this a little bit closer. In this case, it doesn't need too much work. It's more when you've got a very big title that you're going to want to change a few individual letters, but kerning is super useful to get your text to look just right, especially if you're going to use the all caps option. Now, from there, I'm going to go over to the style pane. The style pane has what I call attributes. There's something called, in fact, I'm going to hide them so we can see them all together. So we've got the face, the outline, the glow, and the drop shadow. Those are the 4 attributes of text. Each one can be manipulated separately. So for example, if I open up the face, I can fill the face with a color, which we already saw in the heads-up display. But what you can't do in the heads-up display is choose to fill the text with a gradient. So I'll select the gradient, and I get this gradient editor, which we saw earlier when we created the background. And it starts with the same horrendous gradient, but there's a pop-up menu of presets that I can choose from. Maybe I'll choose something like Dawn Orange, and I get something very different. And this is a fully editable gradient, so you can move these tags around, you can right-click on them and change them to a different color. You can drag them to get rid of them. You can click on this little tab to add more. So you can very easily create your own custom gradient. And the neat thing about using a gradient as opposed to a mask, which we'll look at later, is a gradient is applied basically letter by letter. So you can see the same gradient is applied to each line of text. Instead of starting from darker brown at the top and going all the way down to a lighter yellow, each letter gets the gradient applied. Once you've created a custom gradient, you click this little pop-up menu and you can save it. Now this is not a beautiful one, but just to show you, I'll click Save and I'll call it my gradient. Click Save. And now if I use this pop-up menu and scroll down, there's my gradient. You can see I've got some other custom gradients that I've created in here. Soft blue vignette. There's a variety of my own little gradients that I've created in here that I can choose to add. So that's a great thing to use the style for the face, is to create a custom gradient. Let me just mention this texture. Texture allows you to add any kind of image or video from your project, but there's a better way to do this, which we'll do later when we talk about masks. I'm going to go back to color. We can also blur the face. And there's something called four corner, which if you want to get a little crazy, you can have some kind of fun, interesting looks by distorting the text by using these little four corner controls. It's hard to get a sense of exactly what it does, but you can kind of create a fun look. Especially I'll do that and increase the tracking. And you can create a really kind of fun custom font just by messing around with the four corner controls. And these are all keyframeable as well. So I'm going to hit the reset arrow to reset that. And I also want to reset the tracking to 0 here. And we'll go back to style. So I'm not going to go through the rest of these in detail. The basic idea, I'll hide face and go to outline. I can turn that on because most of these you can kind of figure out on your own. I want to point out the things you might not see and get directly. You can change the outline color and you can change the outline width and give your text a little bit more, it makes it stand out more, especially against some kind of background. I find it really useful to add some nice outline, especially if you're doing any kind of lower thirds or subtitles. It works very well to add some outline to your text. And you can do some crazy things. That outline can actually be a gradient instead of one color. And most of the time I think that's not very useful, but you can do it if you're designing something a little bit, more fanciful. I'll go back to a solid color. And then you can blur the outline, and you can obviously make it much wider, or you can make it on top of the face, which generally you're not going to want to do. It's going to get a little bit ugly depending on how thick it is. I usually tend to leave it under the face. And even the outline, you've got this four corner option where you can distort just the outline and create kind of a cool shadow effect depending on kind of how you mess with it. So just a fun thing to play around and get creative on the outline. I'll undo that. So I'm actually going to hide that. The glow lets you add a glow, and the main thing about the glow is nothing will happen unless you bump the radius up. then you'll get some real glow there. And you can crank these numbers up much higher. For example, the blur by default only goes to 10, but if I drag here, I can make it go, it's really cool to blur it way out. So I'm cranking it to like 300, and you can play with the radius too to figure out how bright you want it, but you can kind of create a neat blur effect that way by using the glow. And finally, drop shadow is probably the most useful of all of them. In fact, if I turn off the outline and the glow, and I'll just add a drop shadow, I'll give it a little more distance, and I'll give it a little more blur. And a drop shadow is a great way to offset your text against the background. So once you've done all that, you've made a bunch of changes to styling your text. All this is in the category of styling the text. You can save what you've done if you want to reuse it, because often you're designing titles to use perhaps in a show on a repeating basis, or maybe you want to give them to other motion graphic designers or other editors. So this pop-up menu up here, if you click on it, allows you to choose existing preset designs, or you can save your own. Now notice it gives you three options: save basic attributes, save style attributes, or save both. What that means is save basic basically means anything that's on the format pane. So it'll save the font and the font size and the alignment and tracking, but it won't save any of this stuff. By the same token, you could choose to save just what's in the style pane. I usually choose to save everything. But say you want to apply the same style to an Optima font instead of a Helvetica font, then you could choose just to save the style attributes. I'm going to choose save both. I get a little dialog here, and I'll call it simple. Choose save. And now when I go to this pop-up, you can see there it is, saved in there, and you have direct access to it. Another place you can find these styles is in the library. So if I go to the library, there's a category called text styles, and it contains these exact same styles. In fact, if I go into the icon view here, it gives you a really better idea of what they look like. So you can choose one that you might like and drag it either directly into the canvas or onto the text object in the Layers tab, and it will apply that style. So I'll take that and I'll increase the size. In this particular style, you can see that the outline is actually using a texture, and it's added that texture in here. So all kind of interesting styles in here. Some are more useful than others, but good to know about, and this can be a faster way to apply these different styles to your text. You can also, of course, edit any of these pre-existing styles. So I've just added this one called Chrome. If I now go back to the inspector, all its attributes are available here. So if I don't really like this particular gradient, I can play with that gradient. And everything is fully adjustable. I can completely work it the way I want. When I've changed it, I could save that as my own preset. So you're very easily able to create kind of any style that you want based on an existing style. For me here, what I'm going to do is go back and just choose something very simple. And this particular one didn't change any of the style attributes. So let's choose basic text and shadow. There we go. And I'm back to a simple font. So that's a quick rundown of the possibilities in the style pane of the inspector. Just remember that you can get access to anything that's already created, not just in this pop-up menu, but by going to the library and going to the text styles.